Tuesday marks Donald Trump's last full day as president of the United States. Trump will leave the White House with what some opinion polls say are the lowest approval ratings of his four-year presidency. He will also leave Washington, D.C. in a state of high alert. The FBI is vetting all 25,000 service personnel involved in President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration on Wednesday. Officials have expressed concern about a possible insider attack or other potential threat. Now, security concerns have gripped the city since a violent mob stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
Downtown Washington, usually buzzing with people and traffic, now a ghost town. On the other side, traffic jams and checkpoints. A city split in two, the center has become a militarized zone. And the U.S. Capitol remains under a strict lockdown just days before the presidential inauguration. We are just outside the closed perimeter, and this is as close as the general public can get to the U.S. Capitol, which is currently cordoned off by a 3-meter-high fence and razor wire, which is currently installed on top of the fence. We're going to go inside that perimeter now to get a glimpse on the preparations that are underway for an inauguration day that will be unlike any other in American history. Soldiers instead of visitors. Some 25,000 members of the National Guard are securing the Capitol grounds. There has been some concern about a potential inside threat, as not everyone is happy with the new president.
It's a sticky situation as far as politically, and of course I have my own thoughts politically, but in uniform, I can't convey them. But I'm here to do a job. I'm here to follow what our organization's doing, and we're carrying on with that mission.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Joseph R. Biden Jr. and Dr.
On the west side of the U.S. Capitol, some normalcy is coming back. Rehearsals and sound checks where 2 weeks ago thousands of Trump supporters stormed the symbol of American democracy. The rehearsals for the inauguration ceremony were just completed, and on this very lawn usually thousands gather to cheer for their new president. Well, this year many things will be different. Fear of an attack on the president means a ceremony with hardly any guests. The National Mall will remain shut down, and authorities ask citizens to stay far away for the sake of their own safety. In the downtown area, buildings have been boarded up again after a year of protests and a pandemic. These views have become a common sight for many Washingtonians, but businesses are suffering.
The business was bad from last 8 months because we're in the commercial area. This is the commercial hub. All the offices around us are closed, and the security has beefed up so much you can't even. We have a little bit of a delivery business, but mostly all the roads are closed.
A life behind fences and roadblocks. Those who live here can't wait until the new president is sworn in.
And for more, I am joined by DW correspondent William Glucroft. William, what's expected on Inauguration Day, and how long could these increased security measures last?
Well, as we just saw in the report, huge security presence, more than double the number of National Guard troops at this inauguration than normal inaugurations. Of course, a presidential inauguration, a presidential event is always going to be very high security, but there's all these extra layers that we've been hearing about the last several days since that attack on the U.S. Capitol by a mostly white fundamentalist mob, really. And the threat, the acute threat is being said that it might extend till Thursday, a day after the inauguration. But let's not forget that these far-right groups, these white supremacist groups, these anti-government groups, they did not start in this election cycle. They're not going to end in this election cycle. And while Washington has long been a very high security zone, especially since post 9/11, it was always looking towards an international or particularly an Islamist threat. But if you watch a lot of that video from inside the Capitol, and I've watched a lot of it, a lot of the language and the religious imagery from these people professing to be Christians, very similar to the kind of Islamist extremism that we saw, that we've been, hearing threats about for decades now. And that threat is going to continue into the Biden administration, as FBI and law enforcement officials have long said has long been a threat towards the United States.
A pretty bleak picture you're painting. Also, I'd like to ask you about another aspect here. We know that outgoing President Donald Trump has not been seen in public for a week. What has he been up to?
Well, as you mentioned at the top, before that report, he made this statement that he was going to allow travel, especially from Europe again, because the United States is going to start requiring proof of negative tests if you're coming into the country. The bizarre thing is, of course, that's going to happen starting January 26th, which is 6 days after Donald Trump ceases being president and Joe Biden becomes president. And the Biden administration said that's just not going to happen. They're going to continue, keeping the corona dragnet, so to speak, very much present. It should be noted that there's been really mixed signals from the scientific community this entire pandemic, whether blanket travel bans even work, if they're the most effective way to control a virus. But the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has said that by March, they're fearing that the dominant strain infecting people and spreading in the United States is going to be this extra virulent strain that we've seen starting in England in the last several weeks. And that's what they're trying to prevent.
William, just quickly, Trump planning to pardon as many as 100 people in his last day in office, according to reports. What are you hearing?
That's right. And I think more importantly on who might be on that list is who doesn't appear to be on that list, which is many of the controversial figures in Trump's inner circle, members of his family who have not been charged with any crimes but could theoretically be preemptively pardoned. Even Donald Trump himself preemptively pardoned, which would be, of course, very constitutionally questionable. And also his aides are saying, don't do that because it would incriminate him. It would basically be an admission of wrongdoing. But he's still president through noon on Wednesday, and he can effectively do whatever he wants in that realm of pardoning. We'll have to see what actually comes out of his announcements.
William Glucroft breaking it down for us. Thank you.
We're now to Jesus Christ and Donald Trump. Evangelical Christians, they played a prominent role in the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, and they have counted among Donald Trump's most devoted supporters during his presidency.
Jesus loves you guys!
Exit polls show that 3/4 of white evangelicals voted for Trump in November, a number virtually unchanged since 2016. They stood behind the president despite the multiple accusations of sexual assault against him and his repeated lies to the American people. So how can we explain this zealous devotion to a leader who's an unrepentant sinner? My next guest says it may have not so much to do with prayer and more to do with power. Catherine Stewart is the author of the book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Catherine joins me tonight. Catherine, it's good to have you on the program. When we talk about Trump's base, we are including evangelical Christians who share a vision of the U.S. And that vision, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that vision would render separation of church and state meaningless.
That's absolutely right. Christian nationalism is central to any explanation of the crisis that we're seeing in America today. You really can't explain how Trump came to power and how so many other leaders on the sort of Republican side of the political aisle are hostile to democracy unless you know something about this movement.
And the attraction to Donald Trump, it can't come from his religious convictions. I mean, this is a man who has bragged about rarely, if ever, going to church. I mean, is this where religious strains merge with those in a culture war in the United States? Is that what we see?
Absolutely. It's a form of identity politics in that it ties the idea of America to specific religious and cultural identities. So Christian nationalism, let's make clear, it's not a religion. It's a radically anti-democratic political ideology that makes use of religion. It sort of exploits religion for political purposes. And it's also a device for mobilizing people to vote in support of the hyper-conservative candidates that the movement favors. And it's, I mentioned earlier, it's radically anti-democratic. It's, I use the term religious nationalism in the subtitle of my book because it makes clear its similarities with other forms of religious nationalism around the world. So when you see leaders like Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Orban in Hungary, when these leaders bind themselves to conservative religious authorities in other countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly see this as a form of religious nationalism, and that's what we saw with Donald Trump. He was basically exploiting religion for political purposes.
And is there a next generation in U.S. politics that represents an even more developed sense of this religious nationalism? I'm thinking, for example, of Josh Hawley in the U.S. Congress.
Absolutely. Leaders like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and many other Republican leaders are also exploiting the rhetoric of religious nationalism, trying to draw people to their side. And often they do it by through these so-called culture wars, through these issues like abortion or same-sex marriage and the like. They know very well if you can get people to vote on one or two issues, you can control their vote. Over the last decade that I've been researching this movement, I go to innumerable right-wing and Christian national strategy meetings and gatherings and events like this. And many of the movement leaders will talk about how important it is to create single-issue voters, because they know if they can get the rank and file to sort of play along and vote on abortion, they can control their vote. And then they use it to enact a wildly anti-democratic agenda, and also an agenda that's not just about abortion. It has a lot to do with economic policy and foreign policy and things that those sort of anti-abortion voters may not themselves agree with.
Yeah, and this agenda, of course, oftentimes it ends up in the courts. And there we talk about maybe the legacy of Donald Trump. He was able to appoint a record number of federal judges. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. They are all conservative, the Supreme Court judges, social conservatives. So we're talking about these people being around for the next 20 to 40 years to interpret legislation and laws. Should Americans be worried?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're going to be dealing with Trump's legacy in the courts for quite some time to come. And if you look also at the judges that he appointed, a lot of them have been nurtured by these sort of right-wing legal organizations like the Federalist Society, which plays an enormous role in finding and nurturing legal candidates and promoting them for different appointments and sort of sustaining their careers. And then, you also have a lot of Trump appointees who have worked for right-wing legal or Christian nationalist legal organizations, including the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is known as a sort of legal juggernaut of the Christian right. And again, they don't just take right-wing positions on the so-called culture wars, like same-sex marriage and abortion. They are advocating for sort of policies that I think it's really underappreciated, the extent to which the Republican Party has allied itself with this sort of far-right libertarian economic wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the big-ticket funders of the movement, many of the people sort of pouring money into these organizations, are as committed to sort of almost like a free market fundamentalism as they are to right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars.
Yeah, and it's amazing, too, when you think all of this comes together and the notion of separation of church and state just, goes up in smoke. Catherine Stewart, author of The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Catherine, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.